She called it the art of the steal. Yesterday, New York Attorney General Tish James, in a play on the title of Donald Trump's infamous book, The Art of the Deal, announced a massive fraud lawsuit against Donald Trump and three of his adult children. Tish James, in her no nonsense prosecutor, unapologetic way, yes, and this is the prosecutor that took down New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Tish James walked to the podium and, with her 220 plus page lawsuit, outlined an astounding fraud scheme perpetrated by Donald Trump and his children against banks and financial institutions, insurance companies, the U.S. government, and the people of New York. And Tish James, in only the way that she can do it, said enough is enough and the buck stops here. The only question most of us watching this incredible press conference were asking is how? How in the world has Donald Trump and his adult children gotten away with these flagrant violations of the law? And what impact, if any, will they have on the upcoming midterm elections? Our experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Despite what Donald Trump may be saying on his social media platform or on Fox News, yesterday was one of the worst legal days ever for him, his family, and anyone that may find themselves the subject of a massive fraud civil lawsuit filed by the powerful district attorney of New York. In this lawsuit, Tish James lays out a 10-year scheme on the part of Trump and his adult children to inflate properties for purposes of getting loans and for basically defrauding financial institutions, and then deflating those same properties for the purposes of, guess what, avoiding federal and state taxes. She gave vivid examples of Trump's scheme, including where he just blatantly lied about the size of his penthouse apartment, claiming in some documents that the apartment was over 30,000 square feet, when that apartment is actually around 11,000 square feet, inflating the value of that apartment, saying that it had a value of somewhere over $300,000. Tish James made it clear that there has never, ever, ever in the history of New York been an apartment that was valued at $300,000, and that Trump blatantly lied about these evaluations, even in the face of professionals that worked on his team, giving him the actual valuations. And this didn't happen once, it didn't happen twice. This was a pattern, this was a practice utilized by Trump and his adult children. Now, this is a civil lawsuit, so there's not going to be any jail time for Trump and his kids, even if Tish James prevails. But the outline, the facts, the allegations made in this complaint are shocking. And Tish James goes further. She lays out a roadmap for criminal prosecution, and then she refers the matter over to the Southern District of New York, the Department of Justice, and to the IRS. So today we're asking, what is going to happen to Donald Trump and his three adult children as a result of that lawsuit? And don't forget, he still is facing potential criminal indictment in the state of Georgia because of the investigation, the grand jury investigation that we know is going on with respect to another very powerful district attorney, Fani Willis. And yesterday, three judges on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals sent a rebuke to the trial judge that appointed a special masters in the case involving the raid on Mar-a-Lago and the documents that Donald Trump took from the White House, secret and confidential documents that belong to the United States. That three-panel of judges said that the FBI, the Department of Justice, can continue its criminal investigation of those 100 confidential records. And again, we know that the Department of Justice is determining whether Trump has yet committed more crimes. So yesterday, horrible day for Donald Trump legally. And we're going to talk a little later in the show about what all of this means politically. But here to help us understand the magnitude of Donald Trump's legal problems is a former Department of Justice attorney. She worked for actually three presidents. So she worked under three presidents, President Bush, Obama, and actually Donald Trump. Her name is Tammy Allison, and she joins us this morning. Good morning, Tammy, and welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, Tammy, so much yesterday. The news just had our heads just turning with all of the legal trouble that Donald Trump and now three of his adult children find themselves in. Let's start with that massive fraud lawsuit filed, civil lawsuit filed by Tish James. Tish James is just unapologetic about going after not only Donald Trump, she went after Andrew Cuomo, so he's a Democrat. So for those that say she's somehow picking on Donald Trump, we have to remember she did not spare Andrew Cuomo anything. She basically ran him out of office, and he was the leading Democrat, not only in the state, maybe in the country. So this is not a partisan, quote unquote, witch hunt, as Donald Trump likes to call it. But what do you make of those explosive allegations of fraud outlined in that civil lawsuit?
You know, we were all tuned in for that press release, okay? It was a display of Black girl magic, to say the least. What I make of it is during her campaign, she stated that, she was going to be bringing about criminal charges. This was like, 2021. So for her to just take her time with this investigation on the civil matter, again, to be very different than criminal, the civil matter here, showing that the course of conduct by, former President Donald Trump and his adult children were lies, to say the least. Lies and, talking about his apartment and how they consistently for years inflated numbers in order to take advantage of the system that, made him, the person who ran New York, essentially, in terms of business and real estate. So the fact that she not only has laid it out in this 200 plus page complaint against Donald Trump, but also to meticulously lay out step by step what exactly happened, who was responsible for it, and given pretty much prosecutors a roadmap of how to pursue criminal charges against him was something that no other attorney general in any state has been able to achieve.
Yeah, and let's talk about the civil lawsuit, because some people are disappointed. They had hoped that the announcement yesterday would somehow be an announcement about criminal charges, because people are anxious to see Donald Trump held responsible criminally for his actions. But we know that in this civil matter, one, Donald Trump tried to settle. His lawyers went to the attorney general and made settlement offers, which she rejected. And two, we know that Donald Trump and one of his sons sat for pretty lengthy depositions. And we know that Donald Trump pled the fifth over 400 times. And so that would be in response to 400 questions posed during that deposition. How are those, his taking the fifth during that civil deposition, how does that help Tish James in her case, assuming this matter goes to trial and a jury has to make the final decision?
Yeah, so for the viewers that don't really understand the justice system, there's a criminal side where someone can actually face imprisonment or a sentence or both. And then in a civil side, they can be held responsible financially or have a judge tell them they can't do something. And in this case, this attorney general, Ms. James, wants a judge to say Donald Trump cannot practice business in this state. Like, what he has done is wrong. He inflates these numbers and it's not okay. And that's the goal here. So him invoking the fifth during the deposition numerous times, 400 plus times, in response to these questions as a result of Ms. James's thorough investigation. In a criminal matter, it cannot necessarily be held against him when he pleads the fifth. But in a civil matter, an inference can be made. A very strong inference can be made that him invoking the Fifth Amendment by not answering those questions makes people look at him sideways, and that could result in him being found, liable for the things that Ms. James has laid out in this very thorough complaint.
Yeah, so just to even make that plainer for the viewers, if he was asked, did you inflate the value of your apartment? And he says, I take the Fifth Amendment, jurors can infer from that in fact he did inflate the value of his apartment, and that his refusal to answer is in fact an answer, and it's an affirmative response. So those 400 plus times where he invoked the Fifth Amendment, of course, that was his legal right to do so, but that can backfire on him and may cause him to lose credibility with respect to any jurors that may be, sat in his case, and could definitely have a negative impact on the outcome of the case. But let's talk about that roadmap. So, as you said, you work for the Department of Justice. You said Tish James gave a roadmap to criminal prosecutors. And we know that's not just the Department of Justice that she made a referral to in the Southern District of New York. She also made a referral to the IRS. So she's like, look, IRS, there's probably all kinds of tax fraud that happened with respect to tax returns that he filed. But talk to us about, how is it possible that the Department of Justice, that the state attorney, district attorney in Manhattan, how is it possible that they haven't already filed criminal charges against Donald Trump and his 3 adult children, given that Tish James says this has been happening over at least a decade? This is not news in the real sense of news. Books have been written about Donald Trump's fraudulent behavior, about how he has defrauded banks, how he's deflated his self-worth in order to be higher on the Forbes, magazine list of billionaires. So where have you prosecutors been? I guess is the real question. And why haven't y'all already put him in handcuffs?
The Department of Justice is a very large organization, okay? And there's a lot of different agencies within the Department of Justice. The workers that work at the Department of Justice, they typically are nonpartisan civil employees, okay? A lot of people, have a misconception that, during his presidency, he was able to control prosecutors. But listen, yes, he has the authority to appoint U.S. attorneys and also federal judges in the judiciary. But for the most part, the men and women that make up the Department of Justice are civil servants that have a duty to the community, and they do a great job. Donald Trump has a system that he sets up that essentially protects him. And that's the way that he structures his business, and the way that he structures the lawyers and other individuals that work for not only himself, but his organizations and his children, that strategically surround him to protect him from any personal liability that could prevent any investigation from finding him personally liable. That's not something that is unique to Donald Trump. A lot of business owners structure their businesses and trust and other components of how they set up their life this way, which could prevent any types of criminal responsibility for the individual. But that does not necessarily negate the wrongdoing as a whole. So what we see here is Ms. James laying out how and specifically why Donald Trump personally inflated these numbers to seek personal gain. And I don't think necessarily there has been an investigation that really digs deep enough to see if, in fact, he can be held criminally liable. And that is a prosecutor's job if they feel like they have enough evidence to bring charges against him.
Well, we should point out, as you said, that the criminal standard is very different than a civil standard. In a criminal case, obviously, prosecutors have to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In a civil suit, it's only liable. You're liable if your actions cause jurors to believe by the standard of preponderance of the evidence, which is like 51% probability that this person did engage in the conduct that they've been accused of. So there is a higher standard of proof with respect to criminal matters. But talking about how Donald Trump has shielded himself with his lawyers and accountants, we know that his main accountant, CFO Weisselberg, did plead guilty to tax fraud, is serving time now for that, and apparently has given the Department of Justice a lot of information about how he ran his business. And we can't forget Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen, who was Donald Trump's right-hand man, his very close confidant, personal lawyer, sat before a congressional hearing and expose this scheme. He told the world in those hearings, and we keep seeing clips of them, that Donald Trump would inflate his properties to get loans from banks, and then he would change the valuation to avoid tax liability. So he laid it out all out, and I think he's given like thousands of hours of testimony before congressional bodies, before Department of Justice lawyers. And because of him coming forward, and Tish James mentions him in her press conference, she gives like homage to Michael Cohen for opening that door. But I do want to ask you a question. So one of the things that we're hearing Donald Trump, as he calls Tish James racist and says this is a witch hunt, his usual attacks, he says that, look, I'm not responsible for any of this because on my financial documents and records that I would submit to banks, I had a disclaimer. And that disclaimer was basically like, these documents are not verified, they're not audited, and basically beware. If you believe them and rely on them, you do so at your own risk. So he's saying it's the banks, it's the insurance companies. It was their obligation to go out with a tape measure and measure that apartment and determine that it wasn't 30,000 square feet, but it was 11,000. Is that going to be a viable defense that, you guys should have vetted these numbers?
Listen, anything is a defense at this point. He sees his close circle of confidants, people that had his back for years turning against him, like you said, Michael Cohen. And, Michael Cohen, in my opinion, has a very personal vendetta against Donald Trump. Let's not forget that in December of 2020, when President Trump was granting clemency to a number of people who shielded him for a lot of years, Michael Cohen, was saying, listen, what about me, Donald? I was loyal too. You're not going to give me clemency, and because of that, and the fact that I started my career at the Office of the Attorney at the Justice, he stated of Bush on Trump, Donald Trump had a right to grant or deny Michael Cohen clemency, but he made that decision not to. And as we see, Michael Cohen has been talking and telling everybody everything he knows up until, yesterday. And Ms. James used that to her advantage. But Michael Cohen is not going to stop talking. And I think that it's going to warrant prosecutors both at state levels and at the federal level to take a closer look and do a proper investigation to make sure that their decision not to bring charges is valid. But if there is something there, they're going to have to go ahead and bring some charges. And if he wants to raise a defense, he has a right to do so. But I'm not sure that defense would work.
Yeah, I want to ask you a couple of things. So that defense that I gave these banks a disclaimer, I can't imagine that if you or I or any everyday person walked into a bank and overstated our income on a financial disclosure form, and the bank found out, reported it to the banking authorities, it gets to the FBI, DOJ, that we could fall back on the defense that, well, I didn't really mean that, or I thought the bank was going to go and check. I mean, that's not how this works. When you are giving information to these financial institutions, you are attesting to the fact that this is factual information. And you don't get to then say, well, I thought you were going to check it and I'm not responsible, because this is what bothers me about the non-prosecution of Donald Trump is what's happening to the district attorney, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore. Here's this woman who, from all we know, has never been involved in any kind of 10-year scheme to commit fraud, has been indicted for mortgage fraud, and they're claiming she made a false statement as she was applying for a loan for a house or condo in Florida. And the Department of Justice seems to be going really hard after Marilyn Mosby. Her lawyers say they think is racially motivated and personally motivated because of their animus towards her. And I have to think, is Donald Trump's whiteness and his privilege, is that why we have not seen a criminal investigation against him for this pattern and practice versus this Black woman who has allegedly, and again at this point it's just allegations, submitted a false document or made a false statement to the bank on what we know to be at this time one occurrence? How do you juxtapose those two and say we have a fair justice system?
Listen, there's a lot to unpack there, and, in terms of Donald Trump in that defense, that's something that us lawyers say a lot whenever we're talking to potential clients or someone that wants to say, well, I didn't know. Well, listen, ignorance or mistake of the law is not a defense. So he can try and he can assert that as much as he wants, but I'm not sure that would work. And, the attacks on, Miss James and calling her a racist, I think that's something that goes into the privilege of having access to information, knowledge, and resources to gather the amount of wealth that Donald Trump has gathered, to be in a position to have all of those people around him, all of those attorneys around him, right, that can advise him constantly to protect him, structure him, and his businesses. That is something that we see in our country, the racial disparity of having access to wealth and information. And that applies directly when we're talking about Marilyn Mosby, the state attorney for the city of Baltimore, the youngest state attorney ever in the history of the United States of America. But she's also a Black woman. Does she have access to the knowledge, the information, the wealth to pay a number of attorneys to be around her to structure the way her businesses are set up, to structure the way her husband's businesses are set up and protect her family and protect her individual wealth the same way that someone like Donald Trump does? We don't know. We haven't seen that here, but we do know that the allegations surrounding Marilyn Mosby happened very much after she was bold and brave enough to bring charges against the officers responsible for the death of Freddie Gray. She was bold and brave enough to go against Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlins Blake, who called the protesters after the riots that broke out pursuant to the death of Freddie Gray thugs. She went against Stephanie Rawlins Blake as well, another Democrat. And recently, Marilyn Mosby was the prosecutor who filed the motion to vacate the conviction and sentence of Adnan Syed, who was very well known on that podcast Serial, where a number of people for years have been listening to the murder conviction from '99 that did not have enough evidence. And guess what? The very Democratic white Attorney General of Maryland, really lashed out on her publicly yesterday. This is a Democrat that's lashing out on Marilyn Mosby, given the fact that she filed the motion to vacate the conviction and sentence. But his office was responsible for turning over the material that would have amounted to a Brady violation, evidence that the defense was entitled to. And Marilyn Mosby is a trailblazer, and she is someone that has really bucked the system and done things that others have been very afraid to do. So the timing of the investigation surrounding her and her alleged perjury and her alleged mortgage fraud is very interesting, given the fact that she has done these things very boldly, very loudly, and very confidently. And the fact that she now is going through an entire federal trial that's been postponed until, I believe, February of 2023, it does bring into question the racial element here. And I cannot say for sure that, prosecutors, have a racial vendetta against Marilyn Mosby, but I do think it's something that everyone around the entire country should be paying attention to, especially considering the timeline and what Marilyn Mosby has been able to do during her tenure as the state's attorney for the Baltimore City.
Yeah, it's really it's mind-blowing to me that this young Black woman is facing criminal charges. And obviously, if she submitted a false statement to a bank and that's a crime, then she's not above the law. But definitely Donald Trump, a 10-year pattern and practice of behavior laid out by Tish James as a fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, a criminal enterprise. He definitely is not above the law, too. And I hope at some point we see him facing the same kind of consequences, criminal consequences that someone like Marilyn Mosby is facing. So what's going to happen now? Tish James made this referral to the Southern District of New York, the Department of Justice, and the IRS. What is that DOJ office going to do with this referral?
DOJ can make a decision to refuse to review it, or they can, accept the referral, look into it, and decide as to whether or not they're going to bring, criminal charges against the former president, Donald Trump, or maybe they won't, or charges could also be brought against his children for their involvement, or any one of his businesses, or any other of his enterprises. But we do know that, the impeachment trial resulted in him not facing any type of criminal consequences for similar behavior in the past. And I think it's very interesting, when we talk about the referral that the Attorney General has made regarding Donald Trump. Brian Frosh, who very publicly attacked Marilyn Mosby just yesterday. Brian Frosh, this white man, Democrat in Maryland, he tried several times to do what Letitia James accomplished with her civil action, and he failed miserably several times.
He tried to do that with respect to Donald Trump?
Donald Trump, yes. They brought federal charges against Donald Trump. Brian Frosh, the Attorney General of Maryland, he, alongside with the Attorney General in D.C., given the fact that at the time he was a sitting president and he had the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C., which used to be the old post office. And, they, wanted to have him face those charges about him personally receiving monetary gain at the same time that he was a sitting president. And what we saw there was, obviously he's not personally receiving money, but, as long as he's not touching the business and receiving that, it should be okay. And, the people that they were trying to prevent, they still were able to pour money into the Trump organization. So I think it's very interesting that we bring up those comparisons, because it's also those attorney generals that need to be compared. And also, like you said, the racial makeup of the Black women in these positions of authority, and their attacks, not only by these Republicans, but also by these Democrat white men in positions of authority. As you stated, Andrew Cuomo, just last week, he filed a formal bar complaint against Ms. James because of her investigation into his sexual harassment misconduct. And that's a whole Democrat. Yeah. So, it's not necessarily the political stuff here at play either. We also have to look up at the racial makeup here.
Well, racial and gender, because we know oftentimes women face both gender bias as well as racial bias. I do want to ask you before I let you go, though, about this three-panel judge, this three-panel of 11th Circuit judges who basically rebuke the sitting judge, the district court judge, in Florida, who appointed the special master with respect to the raid on Donald Trump's property, Mar-a-Lago, who determined that this special master would have the ability to review all of these confidential documents, that the Department of Justice, the FBI, could not continue its investigation of Donald Trump, its criminal investigation with respect to those 100 confidential, secreted, documents that he removed from the White House. Again, another blow to Trump yesterday. Again, how likely is it that we're going to see federal indictments from, the Justice Department with respect to Donald Trump removing those documents from the White House? Now that this 11th Circuit has told the FBI, keep going, keep doing your investigation.
Yes, it depends. It depends here. We heard Donald Trump in an interview recently say, he has the ability to think about it and he can declassify these documents. Sir, that's not how that works. Okay, that's not how that works. I think it's very important that, the prosecutors figure out the source of the documents. I know at the United States Department of Justice, there is a procedure that goes into place as to the classification of documents and declassifying them or not. And I'm not sure, Mr. Former President, that you can just think about something and declassify it. So, the likelihood of charges or not is really going to stem upon the source of the documents, if in fact they were properly declassified or not, in order to see if charges can or cannot be brought.
Well, it's interesting to note, because the 11th Circuit said that whole issue of declassification is a red herring, and that that the FBI investigation and determination about criminal charges didn't hinge on whether Donald Trump thought he was declassifying the documents or not. It really will turn on federal statutes that control what can be removed from the White House and what cannot be removed. And whether they're declassified or not, we know none of these documents were the personal records of Donald Trump. Declassifying a document does not make it his personal record. And so far, none of the documents at issue seem to be in any way, shape, or form his personal record. So we have to keep our eye on that. Lastly, Fani Willis, just another strong African-American prosecutor in Georgia who has a grand jury convened, who is interviewing witnesses, who is apparently building a case related to Donald Trump, calling that election official in the state of Georgia, pressuring him, saying 11,000 votes, just find me 11,000 votes. What's your prediction about when we might, if ever, see an indictment coming out of that Georgia investigation?
Who knows at this point? Because to my understanding, they tried. They tried before, and I don't think they were successful before. And I think that there's a question here as to whether this is going to fall under state jurisdiction for any types of charges to be brought or federal jurisdiction for charges to be brought or not. Where was Donald Trump whenever this call was made? Who was around? I think it just depends. And I think whenever we have this grand jury convening, we're going to be able to see what kind of information they have that actually will stick. Because one thing prosecutors don't like to do is bring charges and not see it all the way through to land a guilty conviction.
Yeah, and just lastly, I know you are a pardons lawyer. It's a lot of the work that you did for the Department of Justice. We watched Donald Trump pardon a bunch of his friends. He's running allegedly for president again. He keeps, teasing that. If he gets into office by some miracle and charges have been filed against him, what authority does he have to pardon himself? Or if Rick DeSantis gets into office and Donald Trump has been charged or indicted or convicted, are we likely to see Donald Trump set free because of this pardon process?
A lot of people ask that even, in 2020, that was a question because we have never really seen, a preemptive self-pardon. We've seen things that are close to that happen before in the past, but never a preemptive self-pardon or that of the family members. But then I think it's very important to raise also, me being an expert in federal executive clemency, the Constitution lays out that the president does have clemency authority, whether they listen to those officials at the United States Department of Justice Office of the Pardon Attorney or not. It's perfectly okay for any president, no matter whether they're a Democrat or a Republican, to grant clemency in the form of a commutation or a pardon to anyone without having to listen to the referrals.
And anyone includes themselves?
It's never been tested before, but, before even, the sheriff out of, I think it was Arizona, Areva, I believe was his name. He was pardoned before he even faced any, charges or had an official indictment. And that was something that was very rare, but it was done. So, it's something that I think more people need to pay attention to. It's part of the reason why I launched this historic law firm, being the first Black woman expert in presidential pardons. This is a very nuanced area of the law, and it's an area of the law that a lot of people have a lot of confusion around, but it needs to be paid attention to because it's a constitutional right. And the same way we see other constitutional rights being infringed on by certain demographics of people in this country, of course, we're going to see, bias there as well. So we just have to wait and see.
Well, that's all the more reason that the midterm elections are so important and who we vote for. The fact that we do vote is so important because the thought of Donald Trump being in office, issuing a pardon for himself and his 3 adult children, or Rick DeSantis doing the same, quite frankly, is nauseating. Thank you so much, Tammy, for joining me this morning. Really appreciate your insights. We'll be watching, as you said, paying close attention to what happens with the potential for pardons if Donald Trump or one of his minions is in the White House in 2024. Again, thanks for joining me this morning. All right, we talked about the legal issues associated with Donald Trump's worst day ever. Let's talk about the political fallout. Is he likely to suffer at the polls if he does decide to win? Or how will Republicans that are on the ballot in November, how are they going to fare given all of this 24/7 domination of the news cycles again by Donald Trump and his legal problems? And here to help us figure all of that out is my good friend, Richard Green. He is a Democratic political strategist. He's an author. He's an expert on political communications. Good morning, Richard. Always a pleasure to see you. All right, Richard, Donald Trump had his worst legal day. Maybe, I don't know, it could be worse, right? He could get arrested. but he had a pretty bad day yesterday as it relates to legal issues. Does any of this matter politically?
By the way, I think there are a lot of us hoping for much, much, much worse days for the orange monster, or as Liz Cheney said, the orange Jesus, which is an incredibly interesting term. I think that, as I've said before, he's never going to prison. I do think because instead of having 12 jurors unanimously vote to convict in a criminal, only having 5 out of a much smaller pool of 6 in a civil trial in New York, I think he's going to be held liable. Michael Cohen has said that it's 250 million, but it could inflate to 750 million when all of the true facts come out, and that it will wipe out the Trump organization. That assumes he's not going to be able to go grift his supporters to make up whatever it is he has to pay. So I honestly think he is bulletproof criminally. He's relatively bulletproof civilly because he can just start up some other grifts and some other things in some other jurisdictions. Politically, in terms of the midterms, I don't think it has much impact right now because the Democrats are not messaging properly. And I had a TikTok and said, you know what's even more likely than Donald Trump going to jail, ... And then you start the TikTok and it's Donald Trump becoming Speaker of the House of Representatives and essentially being, and we've talked about this before, a de facto president for the next 2 years. That is extraordinarily likely. And that's what we should really be concerned about. And that's what we should be talking about, because every time you vote for a Republican for Senate, you're voting for Mitch McConnell. And likely, in my opinion, every time you vote for a Republican for a House seat, you are actually voting for Donald Trump. So if the Democrats can tie all of this horrible news that's coming out about Donald Trump to the midterms in this very concrete way, I think it will have an impact. Otherwise, not very much.
So, of course, I don't agree with you, Richard, but here's where I do.
That's not very common. Don't say of course.
News, right? That's not news. But this is what I like about what you said. See, I do like what you say.
Okay, let's see where you go with this.
That is another reason to drive people to the polls to vote against Republicans. And whether you're driven because of the Dobbs decision, whether you're driven because of the antics of sending immigrants to Martha's Vineyard, or you're driven because the thought of Donald Trump as the Speaker of the House is nauseating to you, whatever it takes to drive people to the polls, I'm in favor of. And each voter is different, right? Not everyone's motivated by the same things. And some people, just that thought, particularly insiders that know politics and know the power of the speaker, that may be a sufficiently horrifying thought that it causes some people who may be on the fence to get out and vote, or at least they're going to vote anyhow, but to vote Dem versus Republican. So
Paul Simon, 50 ways to leave a lover. Democrats have 50 reasons, if not more, to actually vote and to vote for Democrats. I'm curious why you don't agree with me.
Yeah,
it doesn't always happen.
I know. I don't think Donald Trump's going to be the speaker because Kevin McCarthy has been laying in wait, dying to be the speaker. There would be the biggest showdown in the Republican Party over that. Kevin McCarthy has put his entire career, everything about his career, because Kevin McCarthy, if you recall, was a pretty moderate Republican. He was not a crazy Trumper until very recently. So I just don't see Kevin McCarthy walking away.
Reba, do you think Donald Trump gives two you-know-whats about Kevin McCarthy?
No, I don't. But I think Kevin McCarthy gives two you-know-whats about his own position. But we got a lot to cover. So you and I are going to just disagree about that. But let's talk about Mitch McConnell and his praise. Do
we have to?
I know. His praise for Rick DeSantis and the using of these immigrants as political pawns, shipping folks to Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, shipping them to other states in the Northwest, Northeast, DC, Delaware. Mitch is like, yay, this is good. Now, I had a political strategist on, Richard, I'll tell you, that said in his polling amongst African American voters that these antics has caused Black voters to now rank immigration issues higher on their list of priorities than they've done in the past. And so that Black voters are paying attention to these migrants being shipped, and they don't like it, and they're going to voice their displeasure. So I don't know how this is playing with the other part of the Democratic base, but this strategist says this is motivating Black voters.
So bottom line, I think what Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott are doing is motivating Republican base voters, but they're going to vote anyway. Tip O'Neill had a statement that said all politics is local. I think it goes further than that. All politics is human. It's personal. And on a human level, anyone who looks at what these Republicans are doing sees mean-spirited, really, really bad behavior and incredible disrespect for minorities. So if you're Hispanic, and even if you're a Cuban in Florida, and the Republican Mitch McConnell needs to hold that seat in Florida, that Senate seat, or Black people across the country, you look and see how these Republicans don't give two S's about people of color. And I think it's a bad strategy. I think that when you double and triple down on your base to the point where it's so obvious that you are filled with hate and divisiveness and don't care about basic human needs of people, and you treat them like chattel, I think that's going to backfire on them. I agree with that strategist.
Yeah. So 2 headlines, Richard, conflicting headlines about Donald Trump's grip on the base. One headline says that the news yesterday did nothing to deter the base from him. Another headline says Donald Trump's poll numbers are dropping. And one of the articles I read said that Republicans who are running for office during these midterms are trying to avoid having to answer the call because Donald Trump is calling them, basically begging to show up at their rallies and to campaign with them. They don't want him. He's like that little gnat that just flies around your head that you can't get rid of. But because he has this stronghold on the base, they need him for the primaries, but we see them scrubbing their websites and dumping him once they win the primaries. So I'll start with those competing articles.
Both are true. Both are true.
Okay.
Both are true because you have two completely different constituencies. You've got the hardcore MAGA base, and even amongst electeds, how many of the electeds, which is why I do think he will be speaker if he wants it, who are actually in Congress or governors or in state legislatures because of Donald Trump? This is a mafia operation. They owe their political lives to this guy. On the other hand, it's absolutely true that every single day that goes by with the January 6 hearings and everything else that's going on, normal people, or even remotely normal people, are getting sick of this guy. But at this point, I think the base wins. I think the base wins, and that's what they're looking for.
Primary elections, but you just raised a really good point. A big reason that Joe Biden won the election, remember, was because we were so fatigued with the Donald Trump sideshow that was being played out on national media every day, every hour. We are pretty much back to that. If you turn on cable news today, I don't know if we are as bad as we were in 2015 and 16, but we're pretty much back to Donald Trump's saturation. All day, every day news on Donald Trump. Now that worked to our favor in 2020. Might that work to our favor? Not with that part. We don't need the base. You know that. You know the math. We don't need them. We need the independents. We need the coalition Democratic high turnout numbers. So might that drive those independents and those low, I hate to use that word, but people who are often referred to as low propensity voters, might all this drama lead them back to the polls in the way it did in 2020?
Again, I think there's two realities here. When I do TikToks that include hashtag Donald Trump, I get 5 to 100 times the number of views than if I do something that has nothing to do with Donald Trump. Like, let's all register to vote. And I don't put Donald Trump in there. You know, it's like, oh, that's boring. Donald Trump's going to go to prison, or he's not going to go to prison. Oh, my God, right? And that's why all the cable news, you know, they're businesses. They know that this is a soap opera. It's even better than The Apprentice. This is a soap opera we are all addicted to, you know, on one hand. On the other hand, I have said for a long time, and you'll remember this, Donald Trump will not be the nominee. But even if he is the nominee, he has zero chance of winning the general election because of this point. People are sick of him. They don't trust him. They think he's disgusting. They like his policies. But at this point, it's like we can find somebody else with those policies.
Yeah, another point of agreement, Richard. People like watching the train wreck. They like watching the soap opera. But, you know, you're watching a reality show, Honey Boo Boo. I'm going to watch it. But I'm not trying to make Honey Boo Boo my president. So I think Americans are smart enough to say, we'll watch this train wreck and we'll watch this soap opera, but we don't want that guy ever again near secret, confidential documents about nuclear, arms of other countries because he takes it home and stuffs it in his desk drawer with his gum wrappers. I think that's has to be resonating with people.
Yes, definitely. And by the way, I would prefer Honey Boo Boo to be president. I honestly would.
And that was not any kind of derogatory statement about Honey Boo Boo. I compared it to Donald Trump. You say you don't think Donald Trump ever goes to jail. The pardon attorney that we just had on made it very clear that constitutionally, if he were in office, he could pardon himself. And we know if a Republican is in office, they could pardon him. I don't know, Richard, though. This Fani Willis in Atlanta, state charges, not federal. And if she indicts, not before the midterms, and she's made that pretty clear, she's going to wait. She doesn't want to be another distraction.
Right.
I think as Black women have been saving the Democratic Party and the democracy, and yes, I'm going to claim that.
I agree. I agree. We agree.
Another point. Okay, I got to keep score here. That might be the prosecution that could land him in jail. It's not federal, so pardons aren't going to matter. And folks in Atlanta may have the guts to convict him if he were tried.
Again, should he be in prison? He should have been in prison a long time ago. Even my 93-year-old mom wants him in prison. You know, I don't want him dead. I want him in prison. And and then I actually said to her, and I have a TikTok on this, Mom, with all the lying, when we were kids, you would put soap in our mouths. You want to put soap in Donald Trump's mouth? And she goes, no, I'd rather tape it.
Okay, Mom. I agree, Mom. That's great.
But he's not going to jail. He's not going to jail, Areva, because...
Okay, do you think Fani Willis is going to indict?
Yes.
Okay.
But the reason he's not going to jail is in a criminal case, you need a unanimous jury verdict. And it is mathematically incredibly improbable to not have one or more Trump cultists who think he is Orange Jesus on that jury, who will not send Jesus to jail.
Okay, I don't know enough about the jury pool in Atlanta, so I can't comment on that. But I do think we're going to get an indictment by one of these various criminal investigatory agencies.
I've seen multiple.
Yes, I think we're going to see indictments. Whether he goes to jail or not, you're right, is up to the jurors. Let's switch gears for a minute, stop talking about national politics and focus on Los Angeles, because we have a big election coming up ourselves on the same day as the midterms, and it's our mayor's race and our sheriff's race, both very contentious. And both can really change the direction of our city. Let's start with those sheriffs. Our sitting sheriff, who was elected, everyone believed to be a Democrat, everyone thought was going to be a breath of fresh air, has turned out to be pretty much a nightmare, has been embroiled in battles with the County Board of Supervisors, embroiled in battles with pretty much everybody, including the FBI has this horrible trial where Kobe Bryant's wife wins a $31 million judgment against the sheriff's department. He testifies, this is kind of the worst testimony you can imagine for a sheriff, has made blatantly racist statements. Black sheriffs have come out against him as being racist, decides to send sheriffs into Sheila Kuehl's house to raid her house about some bogus contract involving peace over violence. I mean, it's been horrible. What do you think? Is he going to win? It's kind of hard to unseat a sitting sheriff, although we've seen it happen. Our last sheriff was just a one-termer. Can we get rid of this guy?
I think people are pretty restless. I think the district attorney Gascon is going to be defeated when he is up for election. He might be recalled. So I think, it's likely with all of this news that people are going to, especially if they're turning out in big numbers anyway for the midterms because of the mayor's race, I think that's going to be a problem. I think incumbents benefit enormously from lower turnout, and they suffer from larger turnout. So I would say it's very risky for him. On the mayor's race, you and I don't agree on this. I know Karen had a significant lead as of a few weeks ago. I just think people, the message of homelessness and crime coming from an outsider who used to be a Republican, but now he's kind of a Democrat, so he's playing both camps. I think there's going to be a last minute surge for him. I hope, and I think Karen will still win, but I think it's going to be super close.
No, we agree. We absolutely positively agree that this is not going to be a slam dunk for Karen Bass, the Democrat, the true Democrat in this race, the true pro-choice Democrat. This is going to be a fight to the end. This is a battle. Rick Caruso just dumped $17 million into an ad buy. So if you're watching local TV or cable TV and you're in LA, you're going to see those ads that we got so sick of seeing in the primaries. They're back up, $17 million worth. And he's put a massive amount of money. I think I read somewhere it's the largest ground campaign ever in a race in Los Angeles, probably in the state of California. He has like 800 people or more knocking doors, many of them in Karen's backyard, Leimert Park, Baldwin Hills, areas where she's very strong. He has bought up, from what I've been reading, pretty much all of the ground consultants that do ground campaigning. Those are the folks that organize people to go door to door and ask you if you voted, who you're going to vote for. He didn't have a ground game in the primary, and so that was one of the big changes he made in his strategy, was to go, and he realized those ads only went so far. The $40 million that he spent in ads in the primary didn't get him over the threshold. And so now his strategy is to combine those ads with this very strong ground game. I don't know, Richard. I think at the end of the day, the very blue Los Angeles in a midterm where there are lots of Dems on the ballot, people are going to go with the person who they identify as a Democrat. And I don't think any amount of money and any amount of ads are going to make a difference for Rick Caruso.
I'm not so certain. And I'll tell you why. I think the biggest asset Rick Caruso has is Eric Garcetti. Not because of an endorsement, but because we had a Democratic mayor within the establishment, used to be a city council person, inside guy, who for years and years and years as mayor was not able to take care of the homeless crisis. Rick Caruso says, I've got the solutions. I've built a lot of LA. I've built the Grove. I get things done. I think that's an incredibly attractive message for Angelenos who are, I live in LA. You live in LA, right? It's like we're hearing a lot of discontent from people. And I think that's going to hurt Karen.
If that message alone were going to be sufficient, why didn't we see that in the primaries? In the general, we're going to have more hardcore Dems voting than you have in the primary, where you had fewer voters. I just don't see how a Republican turned Democrat 3 weeks before the election beats a true Democrat in a state where she's locked up all the major Dem endorsements, the labor, all of those endorsements that turn out their voters. So it's going to be a struggle for Rick. And he didn't have that message of homelessness has not resonated. People are understanding, Richard, homelessness is about so much more than building buildings. People have built buildings. They've tried to house homeless people. In that debate last night, Karen Bass made an excellent point that resonates with people. Rick, yes, you can build buildings. And by the way, you've never built a single unit of affordable housing, Mr. I can fix it. The issue of homelessness is not just bricks and mortar. It's so much more than this structure called a house. How are you going to pay for the services? And he didn't have a solid answer for that.
So Karen, Karen's great. She's smart. I think she made some good points in the debate. But when you're someone who doesn't watch the debates, who doesn't follow the news, and that's the problem in America, right? The news literacy is quite low across the board, except for our bubbles, right? It's, everybody's watching this. It's not true. People are going to look at these ads. They're going to be undecided. It's like, well, I'd like to vote for the black lady, but that white guy, he looks so strong and he's got such conviction and he's kind of handsome and he's very successful. He can get stuff done. We need a change. Decisions are often made on those body language driven things. And you know that.
I do. Okay, well, let's disagree about the handsome. Let's disagree about that and I don't know how, popular right now white guys are. And I think Rick Caruso will suffer from the Donald Trump taint. Big developer under criminal investigation, being sued, the guy that was the outsider that told Americans that he could get it all done, that he knew how to get stuff done. That's what Donald Trump told us. So I think contrary to what you're saying, people in their minds are going to be saying, wait a minute, we saw another white guy tell us that he could get stuff done, that he was an outsider, that he was a developer. And look what that white guy did to the country. Look how he's shipping immigrants to Massachusetts. And look how he's on the verge of going to jail. I think that is going to be the impact of all those ads. People are going to be saying, this guy sounds a lot. And if you listen to him, he sounds a lot at times like Donald Trump.
Areva, that is the best political strategy point you have made in all of the times I've been on your show. But Karen's got to make that point.
All right. Insult me, Richard. Why don't you?
What do you mean? I just complimented you.
Yeah, that was a backhanded compliment. But okay.
No.
I'm going
Karen
to take
has
this
to
clip
make that point.
I'm going to take this clip and send
it. It's
it
a brilliant point. Why are you criticizing me for complimenting you? It's a brilliant point.
Because you said it was the best political strategy you've heard me make since you've been on my show. You've been on my show lots of times, and you're suggesting that I've never had a bright thought. But whatever.
Excuse me. How about they're all 8.5 and this was a 10? Come on, lawyer. Okay. You're completely distorting my comment. Okay.
I thought
it was brilliant. And if Karen Bass makes that point, she is going to pick up some voters.
I'm going to say thank you. And then I'm going to say, let's take this clip and send it to Karen's team, because you're right. This is a point that needs to be out there. And I think it will resonate with people. Remember the guy that told us he could do it all?
The white guy? You don't have to say white guy, but it's there.
The 5 investigations going on from D.C. to Georgia. Okay, we've got to get that point out. Richard, you're a communicator. Let's see that on TikTok.
Okay, I will do that. And you get this to Karen.
I'm going to get it to Karen. You're going to do your TikTok. And we're going to help her write
we'll help her write the ad. Okay?
Write the ad. Absolutely.
And also, by the way, the most despised white man in America, other than Donald Trump, is Mitch McConnell. And Rick Caruso donated to Mitch McConnell. There you go.
Got to play that up. Got to play those up. I didn't know that about the donations. I knew that Rick sat on the library board for Ronald Reagan, and he has really deep ties. I got to let you go. But what did you think of his answer in the debate when Karen pointed out in a brilliant fashion that he had been a Republican, independent Republican, seesawing back and forth, and that he became a Republican to run John Kasich's campaign. And his response to that was, well, I did that so that Kasich could win to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president.
I think everything he says about why he was a Republican is BS, because the man remained a Republican during the Donald Trump era. Inexcusable. That's it. Done.
I'm sitting there thinking, Richard, so you compromise your values and become a Republican? Dude, are we supposed to believe that? That is
No, he's on super thin ice on that. That's a total BS answer. I agree.
Yeah, dude, Democrats, we stand for stuff, and we don't just change our party affiliation to defeat someone. We're Dems, through and through. So he needs to go back to Democrat school.
So Karen, link him to Trump, link him to Mitch McConnell. We'll help you with that.
All right, Richard, good advice. Always good to see you, my friend. Thank you. We'll be talking with you as these midterms get closer and closer, because there is a lot at stake. I want to thank Richard. I want to thank Tammy for joining me this morning, helping us break down this 24-hour news cycle that is dominated once again by Donald Trump. We thought after he lost the 2020 election that we would move on and that we would talk about other things. But we are right back where we were in 2015, 2016, where this guy is dominating the news cycles. He's not back on Twitter yet. That remains to be seen if he will ever get back on Twitter, but he is definitely a ratings magnet. We can't deny that. As Richard said, cable news know that people like watching a train wreck. They like watching this soap opera, and they're getting it in this Donald Trump, saturated news cycle. So our job is to help you make sense of it. I don't want to be one of those folks obsessed with Donald Trump, but our job at the Special Report is to help folks make sense of the headlines and the news behind the news bites. So that's what we're going to keep doing. My words to goodbye before we get out. We are so close to those midterms. Register to vote, 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 vote. I know you've heard it said over and over again that this is the most important election of your lifetime. I'm not going to tell you that, but I'm just going to tell you that your vote does matter. Your vote does matter. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.